This is another one of my videos on Alistair Parker's short introduction to the Second World War. This one dealing with the economy of Japan. It concludes my coverage of Parker's very long chapter 9 on economies at war. Like Italy, Japanese war production relied on imports, iron ore and coking coal to make steel, bauxite for aircraft production. In addition, imports made up 9/10 of its oil supply and about 1/5 of its food, an essential proportion. Therefore, Japan could only make war if it had sufficient ships to transport all the things it needed. Pre-war, Japanese merchant ships totaled about 6 million tons, but by 1945, this had been reduced to less than 2 million tons. Despite building over 3 million tons during the war, almost 10 million tons had been sunk. A shortage of ships caused a shortage of the materials to make steel, and whilst capacity rose between 1941 and 1944, the actual output of ingot steel fell from the end of 1943 onwards, and stockpiles began to run out. Almost 9 million tons were produced in 1943, but only 6.5 million in 1944. Therefore, shipbuilding was curtailed for both merchant ships and warships to escort them against American submarines. A lack of ships meant a shortage of oil, and whilst Japan had imported 37 million barrels in 1940, by 1944 this was down to only 7 million. Japanese crude oil stocks amounted to 20 million barrels in April 1941, but by April 45, only 195,000. Shortage of steel and oil and the lack of imported alloys to produce high-grade steel ruined Japanese air power. After August 1944, aircraft engine production fell every month. Meanwhile, pilots missed training because of lack of fuel. Already in 1944, trainees received only 70 hours of training, and by 1945, as little as 50 hours. This had an impact on warfare. Whilst in January 1943, the number of first-line American combat aircraft only slightly outnumbered those of the Japanese, by July 1945, they were 5 times more numerous. An indication of the fundamental operational weakness of the Japanese economy. Eventually, the use of kamikaze suicide attacks by the Japanese on Allied shipping in 1945, with ill-trained pilots only being given enough fuel for a one-way trip, is a sign of this deterioration. During the American assault on Okinawa, we should note in 1945, only 20% of the suicide attacks got through to their targets. Mistaken assumptions were very important here. The Japanese military never expected the war to last as long as it did, having made 2 basic assumptions when they began it, both of which turned out to be untrue. 1, that Germany would win the war in Europe. 2, that the Americans would not persist in challenging the reordering of the world by the victorious Axis. Initially, their confidence was boosted by their great victories, but after the Guadalcanal campaign in 1942-43 had demonstrated American tenacity, this was just no longer possible. From the end of 1942 onwards, they tried to increase war production to a level they had not thought necessary when they had begun the war a year earlier, and settled down to defending their conquests to wear down American resolve. But it was too late. The increase should have been started earlier, and the military would have needed to show more competence in managing the economy. The army in particular continued to call up men of military age, regardless of their industrial skills. Both the army and the navy used their long-established industrial connections to assert their priority, to demand careful fulfillment of every shift in design requirements, regardless of the effects on production. Although the government established a munitions ministry in November 1943 to try to impose priorities in the use of manpower and the allocation of resources, the armed services were too powerful. and the munitions minister was reduced to trying to mediate between the army and the navy. Military vulnerability was an even greater problem than administrative incompetence. American attacks on Japanese shipping crippled the economy, and by August 1945, when the war finally ended, Japanese industrial activity was already coming to a halt. The submarine was the war-winning weapon for the Americans, which first arrested and then reversed Japanese attempts to produce more weapons. Before the war, American submarine crews were expected to only attack enemy warships, especially battleships and aircraft carriers, and the USA expected to observe the treaty provisions banning attacks on merchant ships unless their crews' safety could be assured. However, after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt immediately allowed unrestricted submarine and air warfare against the Japanese. Presumably, the Americans noted the success of German policy. Initially, American submarines only had inaccurate torpedoes, and their crews, trained to act against battle fleets, showed great caution in attacking merchant ships. Over time, however, things changed, and they were fully able to exploit two decisive advantages, both coming in early 1943. First, American signals broke the Japanese code used to direct merchant ships. Second, Japanese naval authorities introduced convoys which produced many readable signals. With never more than 50 submarines in operation at a time, and notice how small the American submarine fleet was in comparison to the German, the US Navy was responsible for 70% of the sinkings of Japanese cargo ships up to August 1944. By that point, the Japanese economy was already in irreversible decline. In the last year of the war, American air attacks and air-laid sea mines became the major cause of Japanese sinkings. By then, almost all remaining Japanese ships stuck to home waters close inshore and sought harbors at night. Those that ventured out to the open sea rarely escaped submarines. Japanese escort vessels were by now insufficient in numbers and lacked radar and signals intelligence. They were only able to sink a little over 40 American submarines, 18% of those used in the Pacific. This compared with German losses of U-boats, which amounted to 781, about 71% of those in service, with casualties of 80%. Economic defeat laid the Japanese people open to the terrible climax of strategic bombing. So that ends our discussion of the economies of the wartime powers. Thank you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without which I wouldn't be able to make these videos. You are, of course, very welcome to support my channel if you wish. Like, comment and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. Ring the bell button. Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll move on to the nasty topic of strategic bombing. Have a good day.